Hello, I'm Scott. I hope you've benefited from this video series, Deep Dive with Logos. In each deep dive, I've tried to highlight the best tools of Logos 10. And today we're definitely going to dive deep. Have you ever wanted to start a Greek or Hebrew word study from the English Bible, examine text critical data, look at grammatical constructions, or maybe you wanted to convert Greek or Hebrew text for teaching? The Word Study Guide, the Exegetical Guide, and the Text Converter Tool are three powerful options in Logos to help you accomplish this. And today I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Mark Ward. Mark is the Senior Editor of Digital Content at Logos. He holds a PhD in New Testament interpretation and is going to demonstrate some of his favorite tools for examining the original languages using Logos 10.
Thank you, Scott, for that handoff. I'm happy to serve as a diving instructor for this deep dive series. It's a privilege to serve our users this way and potential Logos users. Many years ago, when I was a paper Bible student, like pretty much all of us were at a certain point in history, that was all that was available. I really didn't have the Hebrew and Greek tools that I now use. That is, the conceptual tools. I didn't have the knowledge necessary to even benefit from looking at the Hebrew or Greek. If I did have that knowledge, I would have been relegated to using things like Strong's Concordance to look up which Hebrew words are underlying any individual English word in my English translation, and of course, which Greek words in the New Testament. That work was doable because of the work of men like Strong. There are other concordances as well, but that work was very laborious. You actually couldn't go, to my knowledge, because I haven't actually used Strong's, you couldn't go and look up easily every instance of a given Hebrew or Greek word. It took software to do that. As time passed and I got some Hebrew and Greek conceptual tools, I also got an earlier form of Bible software before I got into Logos. And I found that it was a super big help to be able to look at all the instances of a given Hebrew or Greek word. That's fairly easy for a computer to do. But I want to raise a little instance that just happened the other day, in fact yesterday as I record this, in which I needed to do that kind of work. And I want to show you why the mere listing that a computer can do of all the instances in which a given Hebrew or Greek word occurs in the original languages of Scripture, why that really hasn't been enough for me, and why I've turned instead to the Logos Bible Word Study for so much of my work in the original languages of Scripture. Let me raise this scenario. This is real life. I was reading along in this article that I was editing for the Logos blog, word by word, written by a friend of mine. His name is Brad Kelly. He spoke very movingly and insightfully and substantively about the grace of God in Scripture. He talked about how the Old Testament laid a foundation for the New Testament's teaching on that topic. The Old Testament is not painting a picture of a God of judgment versus the New Testament's God of grace. No, God's grace is evident in the Old Testament from the very opening pages. And he chose one of those opening pages, Genesis 6. He noted that the King James, that I grew up on as well, said that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, whereas the ESV and contemporary translations tend to say that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And he just asked the question, which translation is more appropriate and how do we know? Now, I'm not really going to answer that question, but I want to show you how I go about getting the details together to try to answer it. All you got to do is right-click in Logos on the English word that you're studying. You, of course, can do this straight from the Greek or Hebrew, but even I, with my Hebrew and Greek knowledge, tend to start in the English. That's easiest. And automatically, in my case, because I've chosen it so many times, the lemma form indicated by this ring graph is chosen of the Hebrew word chen in this case. We're in the Old Testament, so it's a Hebrew word that's being translated, and it is chen. It means grace, charm, favor, or popularity. Then I click on the right side of the context menu, the Bible Word Study, and this is what pops up. In the Bible Word Study, I'll get rid of the ESV for now, I can now see how the ESV translates this Hebrew word. It does so overwhelmingly with the word favor, 53 out of 70 times. It does use the word grace, just 10 out of the 70 times. And as I'm putting together the grist, basically, for me to then process in my mental mill of how do I regard the teaching of Scripture on this topic, and what would I do if I were translating Genesis 6:8, Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord, I am gathering information by using the Bible Word Study. The next thing I often do is look at how another translation translates it. So I'll use the King James just by clicking settings and then typing in the King James. Now I get a different graph. Now grace predominates. 38 out of the 70 times this Hebrew word Cain occurs in the Old Testament, the King James translators use the word grace. And the very first one is, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. You can see right away why modern translators would prefer the word favor. Behold, now thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, from Genesis 19. That sounds like maybe a situation where we would use the word favor instead. I'm just gathering information at this stage, and it's interesting to me that the King James translators made a different predominating decision. It's not radically different. Grace and favor are used in the ESV to translate this word. Grace and favor are used in the King James to translate this word. The Bible word study is not limited to showing me how individual translations render a given Hebrew or Greek word, but this is so helpful. I'm not just getting a list of all the places where a given Hebrew word, Cain, is used. I'm getting it broken out for me in useful ways, in this case by English lemma. That is already a huge step forward from what I used to do so frequently in the Bible software that I used to use before I bought Logos at some point in seminary. I skipped over the lemma section at the top, which is what gives me access to my major dictionaries. I've spent the money to get myself Halot. This is actually my personal copy of Logos that I'm using that I bought with my own money. The Dictionary of Classical Hebrew as well by Klein's, and Chalot, which is the concise Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. I actually have lots more lexicons. Those are the ones that I tend to turn to most often. I actually have them prioritized in my library. That's the other major section of the Bible word study that I use. I want to take you real quick through some of the other sections of the Bible word study to show you what you can get in Hebrew and Greek study by using Logos. I will scroll all the way past all these uses of the word grace. There's a Bible sense lexicon that we provide in Logos that, somewhat like Lohnidah, breaks out the meaning, the major senses of this Hebrew word. Interesting here, my eye falls on the word charm. Where would that occur? Proverbs 5, let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. That a gracious woman retaineth honor, favor is deceitful. This is one reason I would think why the word grace doesn't always get used, because these are not places where we're talking about unmerited favor. In any case, I also do often use the root section. There are syntagmatic and paradigmatic relations that we look at in language. How does a given Hebrew or Greek word relate to synonyms? In other words, is one of the pursuits that we have in language. And how does that root get used? Now, just because two words come from the same root doesn't mean they have the same meaning, but there often is a connection between the noun forms and, in this case, the verbal forms. And they're all laid out for me neatly. And I even get little graphs showing me where they're used. I find that to be helpful on a regular basis. I'm actually going to skip over, just for time's sake, some of the nerdier stuff that we've got in here, and I want to focus on these two sections at the end. I do find these useful. Lemma in passage means here are commentaries in which this word Cain is getting discussed. So, for example, the word biblical commentary, I frequently do turn to for those nerdier discussions of Hebrew and Greek grammar. Actually, I myself particularly am often doing it in Hebrew. I find those notes useful. I tend to be able to do that work myself in the Greek New Testament, but I need a little bit more help in the Hebrew Bible. And the lemmas and passage section of the Bible word study is showing me where individual Hebrew and Greek New Testament Bible commentators are discussing a word. I might get a much longer discussion and a more helpful one than I am getting in my lexicons, which are often focused on brevity. I can click on it, and immediately I'm in my word biblical commentary. And let me actually click right on the use of it. So that'll take me right there. Yep, here we go. Another key word in the whole episode. And now we're talking about Jacob's return for Esau's blessing. I can see that in the heading here. Is grace or favor, and the associated verb be gracious, and the noun present, of which camp, group, etc. is an anagram. So he's going to go on and offer some discussion here that might be very useful to me as I'm doing my study. I've got a lot of stuff in Logos, and what I'm needing is information filters to help me find what is most useful to me. This is true of other books of the Old Testament, and actually of other lemmas as well. And then briefly, the end of the Bible word study. In reality, how often would I reach to the Dead Sea Scrolls before I had Logos. Let's just admit it, 0 times. If they happen to be mentioned in the footnote of a paper commentary, maybe I would get some use out of it. But in this case, I can actually search the Dead Sea Scrolls myself. Now, unpointed Hebrew, that means without vowel points, is of comparatively little use for me at times, but there have been times when I have needed to go see the Hebrew words being used in a Dead Sea Scroll, and I can very slowly work through it using the tools in Logos. If I use the Greek New Testament, I could be a little more impressive in my use of the Bible word study. My Greek is better than my Hebrew, but it's precisely because I have the Bible word study that I'm able to use Hebrew in my exegesis, in my writing, in my preaching. I need these tools. I need the assistance of these tools. What's so significant to me is that these tools are all laid out in one place, all available with a click. They are beautifully arranged so that I can more quickly process and even delightfully process this information. That's how I study Hebrew and Greek words in Logos Bible software. Let me now go on to one other big and one small tool that I use to study Hebrew and Greek in Logos. I'm just going to close out all my windows and show you the Exegetical guide. Here are my guides. I can click then on the Exegetical guide, which steps through a passage in the original languages word by word. I will switch to the New Testament and to a passage that I've been recently studying, 2 Timothy 2. Here is where and how I like to use the Exegetical guide. I do often like to look at text-critical data. I am nerdy that way, and I have reasons in my own calling that this is necessary for me. I deal a lot in this. In fact, I just got a question from a church member, a younger man who's studying for ministry while working as an engineer. He's a newlywed. He wants to know about textual criticism. I'm frequently looking for that data, and it's just easy to get to when I use the links right here in the Exegetical guide. I could go open the NA28 Apparatus Criticus. Actually, that's not the NA28. That should be, is that Tregellus, I think? Let's see. That is Tischendorf, sorry. I've also got, that's probably, oh, that's Alford. I've got, is that Tregellus? I've got multiple apparatuses. Now I'm just curious, what am I seeing here? Yeah, that's Tregellus. I've also got, of course, the SBL Greek New Testament, which is probably my main daily driver, just because I find this kind of apparatus to be most helpful. Those of you who are in the know are in the know. You know what an apparatus is used for. It's telling me what the textual variants are in the Greek manuscript tradition, or in this case, how different major printed editions of the Greek New Testament have treated a given variant unit. And then, of course, I've got the UBS and the Nestle-Lalande 28. Here I am. This is the standard, the main textual critical apparatus. I've got easy links to all of them straight from the Exegetical guide. I can also, of course, go to my major editions of the Greek New Testament. I've even got transcriptions of, for example, Codex Sinaiticus, which I do find useful because of my work, and I think I know who did this at our company. We have some nerdy folks who focus on this sort of thing. I can go right out to the INTVMR, the online repository. I'll put this on my screen for New Testament manuscripts at Münster. This is just pretty amazing. I get links right out to individual manuscripts. Very, very cool. Then in the Exegetical guide, I will often, if I'm using this guide, use it for grammatical constructions. I can go word by word and just have Logos point me to the grammars that I have that discuss this word or this construction, or even often this very passage. Important words, if I'm in a rush and I just want to get a rundown really quickly of what are the things I should be focusing on, and that does happen because sometimes I'm just checking a cross-reference and wanting to do my due diligence, but I'm not doing a full exposition of a given passage, I'll come down to this section. But this is what I do on a regular basis. You don't have to use every single element of every guide. You use what is helpful for you. Maybe textual criticism just doesn't figure very much into your work. You can collapse that section. You don't have to use it. But you can click word by word in the Exegetical guide through what's important for your personal study, whatever you're preparing for, a sermon or a Bible study session, and you can get easy links out to all of the relevant books and resources that will help you study that word. I think this is super helpful. And now to the final little thing that I want to show you, and then Scott can take it away from there. Thanks again, Scott, for this opportunity. I like the text converter tool. So Sumi, I am constantly writing about the original languages. And if I click the text converter tool, I can grab Hebrew or Greek, and I will do that in front of you by opening up my SBL GNT. I'll use Greek this time, and going to a passage. And let's say I'm writing a Bible lesson, but I'm doing it for advanced students. People who have had a little bit of Greek study perhaps, but I don't want to bog them down with requiring them to read the actual Greek letters. I can grab an entire verse, just copy it, the little context menu that pops up, makes it easy to do so. I toss it into the text converter tool, either by typing or in this case by pasting. I'll just hit my keyboard shortcut for that. I will also get rid of all the stuff that came along with it, the footnote stuff, and look what transliteration options I have. I have the SBL Greek method of transliteration, which preserves text critical markings and makes a differentiation between the eta and the epsilon. The E with the macron, I think, that goes above it, the horizontal line, that's an eta. And the E that does not have that, let's see, yep, here's an example. That's the epsilon. I've got beta code, that option. I've got Spanish, their set of common transliteration conventions. I have got the apparatus mark stripped out, but the Greek retained. I've got Unicode composed, and the apparatus marks are still there. And I've got yet another form of Unicode composed. I am not quite nerdy enough to know the difference between NFC or NFD, and I'm not actually seeing a difference between the two. I will say, however, that I use these transliterations on a regular basis, especially for Greek, the SBL Greek. Let's do Hebrew real quick because I am nerdy that way. I will open up in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, Genesis 6:8, Noah found grace in the eyes of Yahweh. I will paste that into the window here, getting rid of, the footnoting information that comes along with it because I have that setting set up in Logos. I use that all the time. And I now have scientific, SBL academic with spiritization. That I believe means that I have letters like the ayin represented here. And then I have SBL general, which is what I tend to use. I like to have it more simple, or sometimes I will use just the simplified version of the transliteration. I also have used actually many times the tool that takes out the cantillations, or even sometimes the tool that takes out the vowel pointing. This is nerdy stuff that people who work in Greek and Hebrew, probably even those who work professionally, won't use all the time. But that one day when you have to sit down and plunk all this out, and you suddenly remember, oh, I don't have to plunk it out. I can actually just go use Logos to do it. I think you'll be super grateful that you have this tool. I know that I am.